So welcome to everybody. Thank you for being on this webinar with us. I'm Natalie Furlett. I'm from Illinois Campus Compact. So this is the second part to the original that we did, which was about the nuts and bolts, or the first one was a little bit more broad. It was about working with Indigenous and Native communities. This one's a little bit more about some examples of programming and how to get on the ground and run. So we're very excited to have Dr. Sally Thompson and Dr. Shane Doyle to help us talk about this subject. Just a couple of little housekeeping things. I'm going to keep everyone muted until you're actually going to speak. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions. There's also a chat box on the bottom here, and I'll keep an eye on that if there are folks who would rather ask their question through the chat box. We are recording this session and we're going to post it on our website. So with all of that, I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Thompson.
Good morning. I'm eager to keep moving along with this topic because of my own life work and so much learning after 35 years working with tribal communities and stumbling my way through. It's a gift at this point at the end of my career to be passing on some of the mistakes I've made and opportunities I've had so that other people have a little easier and more culturally sensitive approach to what they do. And before I get going, I don't know how many of you were on the first seminar, so I'm so happy to not be alone in it and to have a colleague also from Montana, Shane Doyle, Crow Nation member and educator. And Shane and I have had the pleasure of working together over a decade or so, and but haven't been face to face in quite a while. So it's funny to be doing it this way. So let me just welcome Shane. And Shane, you want to just say a little bit about who you are, and then we'll get back to getting on with our program.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on board, Sally and Natalie. It's always an honor to be able to do these kinds of presentations. I am from the Crow tribe. I grew up on the Crow Indian Reservation in the 1970s and 80s, and have since moved to Bozeman, Montana, which is a couple hundred miles away from my hometown. But like Sally said, I'm an educator. I have 20 years teaching experience, and mostly throughout all those 20 years, I've also done a lot of research with tribes, and I've done work with all the tribes in Montana on many different projects over the years. And so I feel very fortunate to be able to call many folks on these reservation communities my close friends, and to kind of share some of the lessons that I've learned over the years with all of you who hope to do work in tribal communities as well.
Okay.
Just to kind of, I guess I could also give a little bit of background. I do have 5 children, and I have twins that are 5 years old. They haven't started kindergarten yet. And so they're here at the house. And so don't be surprised if we get a little interjection from them at some point. But I think they're kind of occupied right now. I have them playing some games and doing some other stuff. But yeah, I'm a very busy family man, and but I feel very fortunate again to have been so involved with tribes over so many years and in such a positive light as well.
Okay, Shane and I have tried to coordinate a PowerPoint to go along with our presentation today. And so bear with us in trying to make this work on the webinar, because we're both kind of new to this. But before we jump into that, today we're really going to focus on the protocols of working with a tribal community that you might be thinking about. You might already have something going and you just want to know how to expand or secure better success. So some particulars and a couple things I just want to point out at the beginning. One is, especially if you're at a institution that has federal support and your project has federal funding, then you're actually legally required to go through a very official consultation process sovereign to sovereign. And that there's a lot available online to help you with that. But I would also just always say that the tribe that you're working with is going to help you to know how to go about this. So I haven't prepared a lot of particulars, because one thing we will talk about today is how different every tribe is and what the expectations are. And anyway, just be thinking about your own project. What's the scale of it, and what body within the tribal community should you be working with? And then the second thing, just right off the bat, that you'd want to know is, are you conducting research and human subjects research, in which case you're going to have an institutional review board process that you're going to want to be aware of and going through. So IRB, and I would just say, again, make note of that, and you would explore that through your own institution that should have a board in place, or somebody in your compact network or something. So we aren't going to go into the particulars of it, just so you know that that's an important thing for you to be aware of. And then here I'm going to just start the slides. So okay, here we are. So today, creating partnerships with tribal
We're
communities.
not seeing your slides yet. Sorry, Sally.
No. Am I still on there instead?
We're seeing you, but we're not seeing the slide. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see something that's, or it's either the bottom or the top. It depends on how your screen is set up. It says share screen, and then it'll let you select the screen you want to share.
Okay. Now are you seeing it?
No.
No. Okay. That says start video, but does that sorry about this, everybody waiting for us. What mine says is share video at the bottom now, which is interesting because before it did say share screen.
It doesn't say share screen anywhere?
No, now it says share video. Okay. Sorry, this was working earlier.
No worries.
Okay. What if I, oh, here's share screen. I apologize about that. Okay. This should do it. Yes or no?
No, you just turned off your video again.
Okay. Share screen is what's on.
Is it prompting you to choose the PowerPoint? Ah, there we go.
There it is.
Sorry,
So we're
lame at this. Okay.
we are seeing it.
Excuse at my age.
No worries.
I didn't grow up with this. Okay, I'm going to shrink it a little bit so we can see the, and then start. Go to slideshow, play from current slide. Okay, good. All right, you can see it now.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so when to engage potential partners is one thing you're going to want to think about. We're going to approach this today with both Jane and I will walk through some projects we have been engaged in, how we've approached it, what's worked well, what's been something we should have thought through differently. So when you're thinking about your own project, think, when is the best place to come in? Is it truly a partnership? And maybe you want to come in at the very beginning, recognizing all the different ways you might approach it. I think most of us have had an experience, whether it's in local government or an organization where you're invited to come give your input, then you realize that it was a done deal when you got there. You just didn't know it. So, school board maybe. Anyway, it's very frustrating, right? So think about your project. If you come in too far down the road, is your tribal partner going to feel like, well, this really isn't a partnership, you're already clear about what you're going to do? Or is it one where you really have a project and you want to see if they'd like to sign on, and then you might want to get more done up front? So be thinking about that. So the advantages and consequences of how far you go in the timing of your approach. And then what inputs needed before you draft your design, to your real plan. What are some of the differences between academic communities and tribal communities, and what you might think about, what would make a good design, what will be successful, what agreements need to be put in place. Do you aim at having a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement, depending on the maybe level of commitment and what you probably have an attorney at your college or university that would be helpful in helping you decide what's required in that situation. And then thinking about, over the long run, how are you going to sustain success? So we're going to talk mostly about initiation, but whatever you put in at the beginning, whatever your foundation consists of, is going to shape the potential for success in the long run. So I'm going to start with talking about the Trail Tribes website project. I ran a program at the University of Montana for a decade, and the first 5 years of it, we were creating this website, and that's when Shane and I got to know each other. And I ended up interviewing elders and educators from 30-something tribes. But in the case of this website, 6 tribes were partners in creating the website. So there are more than 6 on here, but that's because another university had responsibility for 3 of them, so they're not live links on this. But in this particular case, I'm going to talk about 2 of the ones that we interacted with, and that's the Umatilla Walla Walla Cayuse on the Umatilla Reservation in Oregon, and the Northern Shoshone and Bannock in Idaho. So the approach to tribal consultation varied with each community. And I don't know if I had had more time this was a funded project with a timeline, kind of a grant cycle way you do a project, and sometimes you're hurrying on those, right? And it doesn't often work well in working with tribal communities. So I'll say I had not enough time, or I didn't allocate enough time to be really thoughtful about how to go about this in a standardized way. But I'm not sure that would have worked anyway, because each tribe is so different. So anyway, I decided at the outset that I was going to start with people who already had the permission of their tribal community to educate the public. So curriculum developers, their education department, or if they had a cultural center, museum, the staff there. Now, I did that because it's a shortcut, and because I'm not sure that going to the tribal council, often you'll be told, start with the tribal council. Be interesting to hear what Shane has to say about this, but excuse me. Tribal councils are like, the governor of your state and the staff or the legislature. They're busy people, or they're like the president of the United States, just at a much smaller scale. But their responsibilities are of a high order. And so every little project isn't going to warrant their attention. So this is where you need to know the scale of your project and whether or not it warrants going right to the tribal council. Tribal council should stay informed, but that isn't necessarily going to be your job, right? So you're going to work with the cultural center, which is what I'll talk about first. So they kind of take on those responsibilities. So I started with a letter of explanation of the project we were proposing, because in this case, we already had our project pretty well decided, and that was by the federal grant we were working under, that we were to develop this website. And my part at the University of Montana was to work with tribes to give their point of view about the Lewis and Clark exploration rather than the explorer's point of view. So I sent a letter about that and said I will follow up with a phone call, which I did. And then that was really just to introduce myself and to arrange a visit, because working in Indian country, that face-to-face is really pivotal. Success depends on that. I think you need to know each other, because relationship is what matters. And it's almost like things don't click in until you know each other. And I think you probably all have had that experience also. When you know people just through the internet, it's one thing. And when you sit down with them, get to know about their families, get a little bit about their lives, you have a connection, right? So it's the same thing, but it's much more important in Indian country than in academic country, let's say. So with the Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation, and this one started because of a personal contact. A friend of mine on the Flathead Reservation here in Western Montana was good friends with the director of the Tamatslik Cultural Institute. So she put in a word for me. This is a great way to work in Indian country. I shortcut many steps probably by having this personal connection. So we met, we agreed on the topics. Now, I didn't do this, but if you look at the website, you'll see that the category of topics, they all have traditional culture, contemporary culture, and relationship with the U.S. as the themes of the website. But the particulars vary from tribe to tribe as their lives and histories vary. And in this case, because the Cultural Institute was so involved in the website, they took over really what was going to be on theirs very, very much. They wanted these elder women on the front page. They wanted to state, they had wanted their own statement here. Let me see if I can, make that a little, I don't know how to get the faces so they don't block some of this. Shoot. Is there a way to do that?
Are you saying to move the video feed from other people?
See how can you see the whole thing, or are you seeing the
So individual people can move theirs around. So like if yours is in the way, you can move yours over, and other people on their computers can move the faces around as well.
Okay. So they had this, we will exercise our national sovereignty. This is just right up front. They're telling you what matters to them. So I didn't write this, they did. That what matters to them, balance with land and the importance of traditional teachings and the wisdom of their elders and spiritual leaders. So all of this was really important to the way they wanted to approach the project. So what a gift, right? This was a true partnership. We were providing the funding, the technological support, the videography, the layout. It's just a big investment that they couldn't have done on their own, but they totally controlled the input. So one thing at the bottom of each of these modules is, the acknowledgments to who helped shape it, how it came together, and then some particulars, one on intellectual property rights. So one of our agreements with these communities was that although this was being posted on a website hosted by the university, that in no way did that give us rights to their intellectual properties. Anything they had contributed here remained theirs. So in terms of a memorandum of understanding, that was fundamental. We weren't taking anything from them. Tribal communities have a long history of having hit and run, anthropologists, historians, people coming in, taking something and then publishing, getting their tenure based on what they produce. And, that time's over, and it's really important to be aware of how defensive communities are about it. And it takes a while to build trust with somebody because of that history. So they gave us, each individual gave us permission to use the videos, but our agreement, I started off with a media use agreement that I just took offline from some example, and it was about 5 pages long, full of legalese. The first time I tried to employ that with some elders, it was pitiful, right? It was so ridiculous because all of that legal language just got in the way of relationship and created doubt. People started wondering what I might manipulate when I was using all that language they couldn't even read. And so I went back to the drawing board and I came up with a 1-page, very straightforward agreement that was based on trust. Me to them. I was not going to abuse what we were video recording. So in our memorandum of agreement, of understanding, they were assured that every time I would use a clip from that, I was going to send them the clip first to review and decide if they were okay with it or if they wanted to have it modified. And I have continued that years later now, but I do wonder about my own responsibilities as this material gets passed on to the archives at the university. So just something to think about, what you might come up with in your project. What are your long-term responsibilities? And then you see we also are complying with our own university's research and development policy. So in both cases, there were important things to think through before you proceed. So that project, I would say of the tribes I worked with, that one and the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribes of Fort Berthold, which was approached in a very similar way through their museum staff, went so smoothly. And they informed their tribal council. I never met with their tribal councils. Whenever we would be on the Lewis and Clark Trail circuit showing any of the results from films we created out of these interviews or the website, tribal people came, thanked us, felt grateful that this really did reflect their goals. Okay, very positive. Now I'm going to talk about one that didn't work so well. So as you think about approaching, what your challenges might be and if this is helpful, I didn't have any connections with the Shoshone, Northern Shoshone and Bannock of Fort Hall. And so I went through the same process trying to get in touch with the person who was the director of their museum. Now I didn't go down there, it's a long way away. So here was one problem, right? I was already traveling so much and that was just one more trip in a direction I wasn't going, and I was trying to do it over the phone, and she was very uncomfortable with feeling like she had the authority to work at this scale. So she thought, no, this needs to go through the tribal council before she has the permission to do it. Okay, so I started trying to work with tribal council just to get on the agenda for a meeting. That alone was very time consuming. And I was never quite sure that we actually were going to be able to speak at the meeting, but we decided we got to get going. So went ahead and took the risk of taking my videographer with me. So I'm paying for him for his time when I wasn't sure we were actually going to be able to do the project. Went to tribal council. They listened. They said they would take it under advisement or something. So there was no answer that came out of it. And, why would I expect there would be? That was my time frame. Wasn't theirs. They had a lot more important things on their plate. So we stayed around, did that and talked to various people, thought through our situation, and decided that, okay, we hadn't gotten a no, we hadn't gotten a yes, but we could talk to people who normally are involved in public education. So we interviewed a Shoshone poet and native speaker and went to some of the sites along the story of Lewis and Clark. And he was more than happy to read his poetry, talk about his own personal experiences and things he wanted to share. So it was important in this case to always be clear that's an individual speaking. This wasn't a tribal partnership type of a project, or what came out of it. And that is how we worked with the Northern Shoshones. So you see it in the website. It's more detached. There's not that upfront, this is who we are and what we want to tell you. And there's a lot of historically important information in there, but I would say that their module doesn't have the power, potency that those that where we had a good, strong partnership had. So, if I had that to do over again, I would have just had a lot more time, I think. I would have gone back. I would have visited with some of the tribal council. They probably had a person on the council whose job it was kind of to oversee this sort of thing. And I would have taken time to do that for a better success. So just a little summary, talking about do your homework about the tribe's organization and talk, maybe even call the tribal office secretary and visit a little bit. How do things run there? Who would be the key people for me to talk to about this project? And then, even getting to know that anybody, just start having a personal relationship. So tribal council is not the necessary good place to begin. Have a phase in your project where your only goal is to reach that initial agreement instead of moving ahead first. Good beginnings need good foundations. And then just to be really aware of the differences, especially between the way academic communities work and speak and think about the world and tribal communities. And don't be pushing and judgmental about their time process, their time frame, but learn from it instead. Okay, I think I'm going to just hand it over to Shane talking about first project he's going to talk about.
Well, thanks, Sally. Those were some really good points and lessons that you brought up there. And, I have to concur with you on pretty much everything that you said, especially as far as working with tribal councils are concerned. I would say that the two instances where you had immediate feedback and cooperation with the tribal councils are really exceedingly rare. In all of the research that I've done over the past, 20 years with tribal communities, I think maybe 1 or 2 times I've had to engage with tribal councils. And I've actually sought on a couple different in a couple different instances to reach the point where I would have to get permission from the tribal council to do some work, but the work that I had initially tried to get underway was kind of fell short before we actually reached that point. And so, I agree with you that the tribal councils are often so busy with just the day-to-day running of the tribe and the political issues that are always up front in tribal communities. I think here in Montana, most tribal communities are in kind of a constant state of some type of crisis. We have a high rate of poverty that kind of feeds into that culture. But then there's a lot of other issues that are concerned that the tribal councils are kind of consumed with. And so it's actually very difficult, I've found, even as a tribal member and as a person who's been involved with tribal culture my entire life, to engage tribal communities with research projects. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. But I thought the one that I would kind of talk about today is the one that is easily accessible through a couple different videos on PBS Nova. And so this Clovis child reburial that I was involved with has a lot of instances of both bad and good. And it's kind of chronicled in a PBS Nova video entitled The Great Human Odyssey. And that video was actually nominated for an Emmy back in 2016 for Science Documentary of the Year. And in that instance, I was a tribal liaison for the University of Copenhagen and for the, I guess you could say, the owners of a 12,600-year-old boy that was found here in Montana. there you see an image of the reburial that took place back in June of 2014. And he was pretty much reburied at the same place where he was discovered back in 1968. And his bones were held privately, along with a huge Clovis collection artifacts. The largest collection of Clovis artifacts ever discovered in America were discovered with his remnants back in 1968. And those Clovis artifacts, which include 114 different priceless pieces, are all still held privately. Only the boy has been returned to his grave, and I was the one who advocated for that from the very beginning. And the way I was brought into that project was there was a research project that occurred without the tribe's knowledge or without their permission. And that research project involved taking a sample from this boy and analyzing his DNA to see exactly who he was. And so that's one of those instances where research was done without engaging with tribal communities to begin with. And then after the research was over and everything was kind of completed, then the researchers decided to turn to tribal communities because they realized they had come to an impasse, you might say. And that's always the wrong way to go about things. You know, like Sally mentioned, the very best way is as soon as you get that idea, if you want to work with tribes, if you want to do research, whatever it is, begin right at that moment to engage with them. Try to create or establish a friendship there, someone within that community who is connected to the larger body of politic, someone who's knowledgeable, someone who has credentials, I guess you could say, community credentials, and allow them to collaborate with other people within their community to kind of get your idea, get your research project on the ground running. And in that instance, you'll have a much stronger opportunity to succeed in your project. If you just come up with an idea, you work it all the way through, and then you try to throw tribal members on board even before you start the project, that's even kind of tenuous, because it's something that, again, hasn't been advised and consulted from the very beginning. And it's harder to kind of get those projects to really fully succeed. So in 2013, I was invited to this spot here by a researcher from University of Copenhagen in Denmark, who had completed a DNA study on this 12,600-year-old boy. There he is right there, Esko Willerslev. And he was concerned because after the DNA analysis was done, it was confirmed that the boy was actually a Native American, 100% Native American. And in fact, from what little research, DNA research has been done on tribal communities in the Western Hemisphere, which is practically virtually none here in North America, they were able to conclude that that boy and his immediate ancestors, his parents and grandparents, were also the ancestors of basically 80% of all American Indians in the Western Hemisphere. So he was an extremely important child. And given the fact that he was related to pretty much every single Native American on both continents, before they published their study, they wanted to go to tribes and get the tribal feedback, and if the tribes were willing to allow this publication to go forth. And so they were really put themselves in kind of a tenuous position. Again, they didn't really know what to do. And so they brought me on board, and they kind of asked me in a lot of ways to help them fix what had gone wrong in their process. And so the first thing I told Esko was, well, we need to go to the tribal communities. And, like Sally said, there's no substitute for going to the tribal communities. It takes time, to get in your car, to drive. It takes some time to establish people who you're going to meet there. It takes money. again, to get out on the road, to pay for the traveling. But it's all going to be well worth it, because very rarely, I would say 99% of the time, you will not have success working with tribal communities through any kind of telecommunication, whether it be on the phone or over the internet. You just have to get there. You have to go to these communities. You have to see people face to face to gain the trust of who you are and your commitment to their participation in whatever project that you have in mind. And so I took Eska Willerslev, the researcher from Copenhagen, to every reservation in Montana, and we informed them of what had happened, of the study and of the results of the study. And there was a real mixed, I guess, reception to what we discovered. And then finally, after consulting with all the tribal communities, we were told that we should probably go to the Montana Burial Preservation Board. Here you see a photo of the folks that are a member of that board today. And I worked with the with the Montana Burial Board for about 7 months before the reburial of the child actually took place. And they all had representatives from their tribes on the board. And these representatives were typically tribal historic preservation officers. And the tribal historic preservation officers are the people in each tribal community who are kind of charged with looking at all of the different, historic portions of the culture, artifacts of the culture that have come into mainstream culture, I guess you could say. And so these folks here had to make the decision whether or not they wanted to support a reburial, whether they wanted to be part of a reburial. Although they all advocated for a reburial, they had questions about whether they really wanted to participate, because they felt like it was a very disrespectful research project that had occurred without their tribe's knowledge or permission. And so it took some time to explain and to describe to the burial board why this reburial was important to all of us. And like I said, it wasn't that the folks were opposed to the reburial in principle. It was just the idea of, I guess, forgiving, if you will, the researchers and allowing them to go ahead and move forward with this reburial. And there were moments where things almost didn't come through very well. But fortunately, the reburial did happen. There were tribal representatives there from most of the tribes in Montana, and also from tribes out of Washington. Umatilla had representatives there. Tribes along the Columbia River had some representatives there. And here you see a photo of the aftermath of the reburial. There was a real nice breakfast that was held that morning after the boy was returned to the ground. And there is Sarah Anzik, the lady who had kind of inherited the child's remains, receiving a Pendleton blanket from the tribal communities who attended the reburial to honor her. Because legally speaking, she was not required to return those bones to the ground. And she received a lot of feedback from her colleagues and from archaeologists throughout the state and throughout the world, really, and here in America especially, that encouraged her not to rebury that boy, that he was too important of an artifact to be put back in the ground. And so, I think that it was a testament to her courage and her commitment to taking the advice and the consultation of the tribes to heart, and to really respecting their wishes and having that boy return to the ground. And so I can say it was mostly a happy ending in that instance. Again, the boy's back in the ground. Unfortunately, from a lot of people's perspective, the artifacts that he was buried with have not been returned to him. And we know there's no process right now or anything like that that I know of to get those items returned to his burial ground. But I'm assuming that at some point that will occur. If I could give you one small anecdote, I'm friends with the Crow Tribal Chairman. At the time, the Crow Tribal Chairman, we have a new one since then. And that's another thing to consider too, is the tribal councils and chairmen are often pretty unstable bodies. They tend to switch up quite often. But at the time that this process was being undertaken, I was able to visit with the tribal chairman from Crow, and I informed him of the whole situation, of the boy, of the DNA analysis, really kind of a startling discovery that was made. And his comment to me was, deal with the TIPO director, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. He really wasn't all that interested in it. He didn't really have the time or interest to kind of engage with it. He certainly didn't think the tribal council was going to be interested in it. And so he just wanted me to go to the point person, who was appointed by the tribe in that matter. But again, every instance in research is going to be different. There's tribal community colleges that can be turned to as well. And so those are always real important bodies to consider as well. But you just don't ever really know what's going to happen in an instance like that. And so you got to take the good with the bad. So I think that probably it's about it for that topic, Sally.
So let me see. Do I share screen again to come back on, or?
There should be a button that says start video.
Okay. All right. So what I see. No, I just screwed that up again, didn't I? Stop share.
There you are.
Okay. Thank you, Shane. That's such an important case and really interesting to get to hear the firsthand account of that. So we have, 10, 12 minutes left. I'd love to hear some of the particulars of people's questions or thoughts, or sharing other experiences that kind of build on what we've been talking about. So can we open that up, Natalie?
Yeah, I can unmute everyone. All right, so everyone is now available to talk. If anyone has questions, or if you're more comfortable, you can still use the chat box and write those in.
And we'd love to get feedback on some of the particular challenges people have, or the projects they're thinking about, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to keep moving with this ongoing conversation and really help build some successes.
Hi, Sally and Shane. This is Renee Grolowitz, professor of anthropology in Wisconsin. I want to thank you for sharing your experiences, but in particular, Sally, part of my problem is the IRB, and trying to get, because the IRB, construction of the members of the IRB changes more frequently than tribal council, but trying to get them to understand the protocols working with Native peoples needs to be different. It doesn't, I need to have the agreement with the nation. I need to have approval to be there. But like you were working with your consent form, holy camole, try to get a consent form through. That's a lot of challenges working with the IRB and Indigenous peoples.
Well, just briefly, and then you and I could have a follow-up conversation if you'd like, but I never had to go through IRB. Our attorneys at the university always concurred that I was not doing research. That so that if there's a way, if you're not doing research and you're doing a collaboration, in that case, I wasn't using the data. There was no data. People were sharing what they wanted to share, and they wanted it made public. I wasn't doing any manipulation. I wasn't exposing or, no potential of exposing something that people hadn't chosen to, because they were full partners. So if you can get around IRB because you actually aren't doing research, that's the streamlined way. And if that's not your situation and you are doing research, then I'm happy to visit with you more about that. Or Shane, do you have any experience with IRB?
I've actually never had to go through IRB with tribes, but following the reburial, Eska Willerslev wanted to pursue some genetic testing with the Plains Indian tribes. And so we went about visiting all the tribal communities and trying to get them interested in doing DNA testing within the communities. And at that point, we were faced with going through an IRB process. But we never got, there was never enough of a momentum, I guess, for us to actually make it to that point. None of the tribal communities decided that they were interested, at least from the friendships and the relationships that we had, wanted to support that kind of research. If they had supported it to the point where we could have done that kind of research, then we would have faced the IRB and the tribal council. But I can tell you that the IRB is not going to be as important as what that tribal council says. Because whether or not you pass the IRB, the tribal council can still say, no, we don't like that. We don't want to have anything to do with it. We don't care what the IRB says. We don't want it. On the other hand, if you go to the tribal council without an IRB, or maybe you haven't been able to completely pass an IRB protocol, they can say, no, we don't care. We want to do this. We think this is important. And we want to support this, and we don't care about any IRB. We don't even know what an IRB is. What we want you to do is the research that we're putting forth, that you're putting forth. And so I think the IRB is important on one hand, but it's never going to top what the tribal council wants to do.
Well, yeah, I agree. And that was kind of the catch-22 that I had is, I wanted an IRB. I wanted it listed as research because some of my collaborators on the tribe, they too would like to have had their name with the publications and doing research for their education as well. So, right, working with the IRB to come up with a draft protocol and said everything but the consent form is going to be like this. And then going to the tribal council and trying to negotiate a consent form. And I absolutely respect the council and peoples to participate or not, or limit the scope and change the scope. And then when the scope changes and we have an additional focus, that's when I got to go back to the IRB and say, this is a new focus. These are the new questions. And so I end up with a catch-22 is always for me though, the tribal people have precedence in what I do and how I do it and with whom. And then the catch-22 of being viewed as breach of scholarship and breach of protocol from my professional perspective, from the IRB. Wow. I haven't been called on it, but a couple of times there were people questioning my level as a scholar because I was not adhering to IRB protocols. That's all. Just wanted to share that mess.
I'd love to have some follow-up on this, Renee. It's a really important subject and one that limits a lot of good work, I think. It's there for an important reason. And as is often the case, sometimes just then the rules become their own problem. So anyway, we could visit later. Any other topics or thoughts or sharing from what we've talked about so far? You getting anything written, Natalie?
No, we've got a quiet bunch today.
Okay. I have another project that I'll just briefly mention to you that I think I'm not going to go back to the slides on it. won't matter, but I've been trying as an individual. I'm no longer at the university. I'm retired. I have my consulting business, but one project I always wanted to go back and do when I had some time was working with young people on the Blackfeet Reservation. That's because I had identified 60 paintings from 1846 that were of Blackfeet and Gros Ventre hunting camps. Paintings by a Jesuit, self-taught Jesuit. And they'd always been touted by anthropologists as good as photographs, basically, the next best thing, since they didn't have photographs then. So I used one of these illustrations in a slide presentation at a high school class in Browning, Montana, on the Blackfeet Reservation years ago. And a kid in the back row says, "That ain't right." I go, "What?" I said, "Tell me about that." And he starts picking apart the painting from a traditional cultural perspective. Well, I was blown away. This kid who I kind of thought was snoozing in the back row at his perception of perspective. And what I had taken for this is, the next best thing to a photograph, he unveiled how differently we see the world, even when we're standing shoulder to shoulder. So it was the beginning of something really, really critical, and it's just driven me in terms of, think about our politics in America today. We can be standing shoulder to shoulder and looking at the same data set and having completely different experiences of reality, and how often that is the case when it's an academic trained person and a Native person, especially a Native person who's grown up on reservation. I think that's true regardless, but if you're in your homeland base and that's your reality, it's different than a non-Native person from an urban environment or just somewhere else. And we don't understand those things. So, we're talking a lot about unconscious bias these days. Well, there is so much to tease out in that world. So anyway, I've been trying to get a project going in Browning with the schools, and I've spent a lot of time that just seems wasted now in trying to do it through the school system because they're so overwhelmed. And Shane's alluded to all the crisis to crisis management of tribal councils. And so it's kind of the same at the schools on reservations. And so that hasn't gone anywhere. And I've now tried through a social services branch of the tribal government, and that may to a project. But again, phase one, I just needed to slow down my expectations instead of thinking we're just going to hit the ground running and doing this art is healing, Blackfeet world from the inside out project. It's a long and slow trying to find the right allies so it becomes a grounded, successful undertaking and not just, my idea of some cool project and hit and run and then it's done. There's great potential here, but I got to have enough patience and acuity. I need to understand the system. I need to understand I've worked with the Blackfeet for a long, long time, and I still, I'm struggling to find the right pathway in. Somewhat because because people change in their positions of authority, but also it's a different thing we're trying to do, and patience is just a huge part of it. So it's a current challenge. So Natalie, I don't know if people know how to reach me, but I'm happy to share my
Yeah, so what I've done in the past is I have, so this is obviously being recorded and I will put it on the website and I can send that out to everyone as soon as it's up, which should be later this afternoon, early tomorrow. I can include your email and Shane, if it's okay, I can include yours as well so that folks can get in touch with you.
Sure.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. This was
quiet out there. Feel free to, let us know what you're working on and what your challenges are.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, Natalie.
Love to be able to help.
Thank you. I did get one woman had to leave early, but she's, again, she also offered because she's from a Native community that she would be willing to talk as well. So she's out in Oklahoma. So I can share all that information over email with folks. So
Great.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yep. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.